It was the winter of 1943, and the skies over Europe had become a crucible of fire and steel. For years, the Luftwaffe had ruled these heavens with unrivaled confidence. Their aces, men like Adolf Galland, Gunther Rall, and Johannes Steinhoff, had written their names into the annals of aerial warfare. They had fought the best the Allies could send: Spitfires, Hurricanes, Thunderbolts, and Lightnings. And while the battles were fierce, the German pilots had always found a way to maintain the edge. But that dominance was fading. The tide of war was shifting, and somewhere in the cold hangars of Britain and America, a new predator was being prepared. Sleek, silver, and destined to change everything. By 1943, the Allied bombing campaign over Germany was in full swing. The vast formations of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators rose each day like a storm of metal, heading deep into the heart of the Reich. Their mission was to break the German war machine from the air. Factories, refineries, railways, and cities, all were targets. But those bombers were vulnerable. They were flying into the most heavily defended airspace on Earth, where experienced Luftwaffe squadrons waited like wolves at the edge of the forest. Escort fighters such as the P-38 Lightning and P-47 Thunderbolt did their best, but their range was limited. They could only accompany the bombers part of the way before turning back, leaving the bomber streams exposed over Germany. When that happened, the Luftwaffe pounced. For a time, it seemed unstoppable. German interceptors, Bf-109s and Fw-190s, would slice into the bomber formations, shredding them with cannon fire. It was brutal, efficient, and devastating. The American bomber crews began calling it flying into hell, and for the Luftwaffe, it was business as usual. They were the masters of the air, defending their homeland with unmatched skill. But what they didn't know was that far across the Atlantic, engineers and test pilots were perfecting something extraordinary, an aircraft that would soon rewrite the rules of aerial warfare. The P-51 Mustang began its life humbly enough. Originally designed for the British under desperate wartime conditions, its first versions were good, but not great. That changed when the British mated it with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same power plant that had made the Spitfire legendary. Suddenly, the Mustang was transformed from a capable fighter into a high-altitude, long-range predator. It could fly faster, climb higher, and travel farther than any Allied fighter before it. And crucially, it could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. To the Luftwaffe aces, the first encounters with the Mustang were disorienting. At first glance, it looked sleek but unfamiliar. Many dismissed it as another American attempt at copying British design, a curiosity rather than a threat. But that illusion shattered quickly. The first Mustangs entered combat over Europe in late 1943, and their effect was immediate. German pilots who had grown used to outmaneuvering or outclimbing their opponents suddenly found themselves being hunted by aircraft that could match them in every way and often exceed them. The Mustang's Merlin engine gave it incredible performance at high altitude, where the air battles raged. It could reach speeds approaching 440 miles per hour, yet still turn tightly and remain stable under fire. Its 650 caliber Browning machine guns delivered punishing accuracy, while its streamlined frame allowed it to conserve fuel and cover immense distances. To the bomber crews looking out of their gun turrets, the sight of those silver Mustangs sweeping in to clear the skies was a vision of hope. But to the Luftwaffe pilots watching from above, it was a nightmare in the making. Johannes Steinhoff, one of Germany's most respected fighter leaders, later described that first shock in his memoirs. "We thought it was just another Thunderbolt," he wrote, "but then it didn't leave. It climbed with us. It dived with us. It stayed." The Mustang's endurance was unlike anything they had faced. German pilots were used to American fighters turning back halfway through a mission. Now the Mustang stayed all the way to the target, and all the way home. Adolf Galland, the famed general of fighter forces, realized almost immediately what it meant. "When the Mustangs arrived," he later admitted, "we knew the war in the air was lost." Coming from a man who had once been the embodiment of Luftwaffe confidence, that statement carried the weight of surrender. The Mustang was not merely another aircraft, it was a strategic weapon. It robbed the Luftwaffe of its final advantage, the ability to control when and where to fight. Gunther Rall, another of Germany's top aces with 275 victories to his name, spoke of the Mustang with a mix of respect and resignation. "It was the perfect combination," he said. "Speed, range, maneuverability. It was a masterpiece of aerodynamics." Rahl was not easily impressed. He had faced every Allied type in the sky and survived countless engagements. But the Mustang was different. It changed the rhythm of the air war, he said. You could no longer pick your moment. The Mustang dictated it. Reports from the front began to paint a grim picture for the Luftwaffe. Missions that had once been routine interceptions now turned into desperate survival. Veteran German pilots who had once descended confidently upon bomber formations now found themselves under attack before they even reached the bombers. The Mustang squadrons operated with ruthless efficiency. They flew in coordinated groups, patrolling the skies above and ahead of the bomber streams, cutting down interceptors as they climbed. One pilot, Walter Schuck, remembered seeing a flight of Mustangs for the first time while flying his FW-190. They were elegant and deadly, he said. When you saw that silhouette, you knew you had to fight for your life. The Mustang was faster in a dive, steadier in a climb, and astonishingly agile in a turn. It could meet a Bf-109 on equal terms and then run down an FW-190 in a chase. The shock rippled through Luftwaffe units across Western Europe. Ground controllers began issuing warnings whenever Mustang formations were sighted. Achtung, Mustangs above. The phrase became infamous, whispered with dread by both veterans and new recruits. Even the most experienced aces began to acknowledge the shift. The air war, once a contest of skill, was now also a battle of endurance and machinery, and the Luftwaffe was running out of both. The younger German pilots had the hardest time. Many of them were poorly trained, sent into battle with only a few hours of flight time. Against the Mustang, they stood little chance. The veterans tried to adapt using hit-and-run boom and zoom tactics from high altitude, diving in and breaking away before the Mustangs could respond. But even those strategies began to fail. The Mustangs were too many, too fast, and too well coordinated. Still, there was admiration among the German pilots. In the quiet moments after battle, when the adrenaline had faded and the smoke had cleared, many would admit, sometimes even to their enemies, that the Mustang was a magnificent machine. They respected it, feared it, and in some cases, even loved it. For men who had dedicated their lives to mastering the art of flight, it was impossible not to recognize brilliance when it appeared before them. As 1944 unfolded, the Mustangs became ever more present, their numbers growing, their dominance complete. The Luftwaffe aces fought on, but their days of supremacy were over. The sky that had once been theirs now belonged to another generation of pilots. Young Americans in their polished, silver-winged steeds who came from half a world away to fight in a war not of their making, but one they were determined to finish. By early 1944, the transformation of the air war was unmistakable. Where once Luftwaffe patrols could sweep across the sky with confidence, now they moved cautiously, aware that somewhere, perhaps unseen, perhaps just beyond the clouds, Mustangs waited. The Americans called it owning the air, and that phrase perfectly captured the new reality. The Mustang didn't just fight the Luftwaffe, it stalked it. Every mission was now a test of nerve and survival for German pilots who had once felt invincible. The bomber streams that had once been massacred now pressed on with increasing assurance. Thousands of feet above the German countryside, they watched as their long-range escorts fought ferocious duels against the interceptors rising to meet them. For the crews inside the flying fortresses, the sight of Mustangs diving through contrails to engage enemy fighters was something akin to witnessing divine intervention. They had spent months dreading the moment their escorts turned back, but now, even deep over Germany, the Mustangs were there, always there. The psychological effect on both sides was enormous. For the Americans, morale soared. For the Luftwaffe, it plummeted. There was an unspoken understanding that the Mustang represented more than just a new aircraft. It was a symbol of Allied industrial might, technological brilliance, and sheer determination. The German pilots could feel it in their bones. No matter how brave they were being outproduced, outtrained, and increasingly outflown. Adolf Galland saw the shift firsthand. As General der Jagdflieger, he had commanded the Luftwaffe's fighter arm through its glory years. Now he was watching it crumble. He urged the high command to prioritize new technologies, the Me-262 jet fighter, for instance. But bureaucracy and Hitler's constant interference delayed everything. The Mustang's arrival made Galland's task impossible. Even his elite formations, like Jagdverband 44, found themselves overwhelmed by swarms of Mustangs. In private, Galland confided to his officers, "The Mustang has taken away our last advantage." On the ground, mechanics and armorers worked frantically to keep the dwindling fighter units operational. Supplies were scarce, fuel was rationed, and spare parts were becoming luxury items. Many Luftwaffe fields were under constant attack from P-51s and P-47s, which now roamed freely across occupied Europe. The hunters had become the hunted. Mustang pilots would strafe airfields at dawn, catching German fighters as they tried to take off. By the time the Luftwaffe scrambled, the Americans were already climbing back into the sky, their engines echoing like a prophecy. For the German aces who survived the early onslaught, each mission became a balancing act between duty and survival. Gunther Roll, despite being shot down multiple times, continued to fly. He described the sensation of seeing Mustangs at altitude. They glimmered like silver ghosts. They seemed everywhere at once. You could not hide from them. Even when Roll managed to outmaneuver one, there were always more closing in. It was not a duel anymore, he said. It was a storm. Johannes Steinhoff, too, recognized the futility but kept flying. His men admired his courage, though they also sensed his frustration. He once remarked, "We were fighting with pride, but pride does not keep you alive." The Luftwaffe pilots still scored victories. There were skilled German aces who could still down a Mustang through experience and instinct, but each victory came at greater cost. By 1944, for every Allied pilot lost, the Luftwaffe was losing 3, sometimes 5. The Allied command understood this perfectly. They rotated their pilots regularly, ensuring they stayed fresh. The Luftwaffe could not afford such luxury. Their veterans flew until exhaustion or death. Many of the great aces from the early years of the war were gone by the time the Mustangs arrived, killed, captured, or grounded by injuries. Those who remained carried the weight of a dying force. Walter Schuck's squadron experienced this collapse firsthand. "We had boys flying who could barely land the plane," he recalled. "The Mustangs came for them, and they never came back." He described one encounter where his FW-190 was surrounded by Mustangs after attacking a bomber formation. "I dove. They dove. I climbed. They climbed. They were always there." Schuck managed to escape by diving into the clouds, his engine howling as tracer rounds tore past him. When he landed, his plane was riddled with bullet holes, the paint scorched from near misses. "It was like being chased by death," he said simply. The airfields themselves became scenes of chaos. Once orderly and disciplined, they now resembled desperate outposts. Crashed planes littered the edges, fuel drums burned, and young recruits smoked nervously beside their machines. When the distant roar of engines echoed overhead, every man froze. Was it their own planes returning, or Mustangs coming to finish the job? Among the Allied pilots, stories of duels with the Luftwaffe aces spread quickly. Men like George Preddy, Bud Anderson, and Chuck Yeager became legends. They respected their German opponents deeply, even admired them. Yeager, who would later become the first man to break the sound barrier, spoke of the skill and bravery of German pilots, but he also knew the Mustangs had the upper hand. "They were damn good," he said, "but we had the airplane, the training, and the numbers. They were brave, but beaten." There was a growing sense of inevitability. Each month that passed saw fewer and fewer German fighters rise to challenge the bombers. The Luftwaffe was running out of fuel, out of pilots, out of hope. Yet still, they fought. Some of them, even knowing the futility, took off one last time just to meet the enemy head-on. It was courage bordering on madness, a final salute to a lost cause. For the Americans, the Mustang was more than a weapon. It was a promise fulfilled. The long-range escort that commanders had dreamed of was now a reality. General James Doolittle, in charge of the 8th Air Force, understood what it meant. He changed the rules, allowing his fighter groups to break away from the bombers to seek out and destroy the Luftwaffe in the air and on the ground. The result was devastating. Within months, the German fighter arm was shattered. The Mustang pilots themselves often spoke with awe about their aircraft. They loved how it handled, how it responded, how it made them feel untouchable. "It was like flying a scalpel," one pilot said. "Smooth, sharp, perfect." Another compared it to dancing. "The airplane seemed to think with you." When they faced the Luftwaffe aces, they knew they were fighting men who had spent years perfecting the art of combat flying. But now, for the first time, the Americans had a machine that let them meet those aces on equal ground and win. The encounters between Mustang and Messerschmitt, between Focke-Wulf and Thunderbolt, became the stuff of legend. Pilots on both sides would later describe the eerie beauty of it all. The sun glinting off wings, the condensation trails twisting like white serpents, the sudden flashes of tracer fire that decided life and death in a heartbeat. To those who lived through it, the sky itself seemed alive, a shifting canvas of heroism and tragedy. By the time spring arrived in 1944, even the most hardened German commanders could see the writing on the wall. The Mustang had changed everything. Its long, sleek fuselage and unmistakable whistle as it dived had become symbols of Allied air power. The Luftwaffe, once feared across Europe, was now struggling simply to survive. And yet, despite all of it, there remained a strange mutual respect. When captured Luftwaffe pilots met their Mustang adversaries in POW camps, many found themselves talking not of hatred, but of admiration. They spoke about flight, about machines, about the joy and terror of combat. In that strange fraternity of warriors, enemies became equals, men bound by the same sky. The first time a Luftwaffe ace truly faced the Mustang in combat and realized what he was up against, the moment etched itself into his memory forever. For many of these men, who had grown accustomed to dictating the tempo of every engagement, the sudden shift was more than tactical. It was existential. The sky had always been their domain, a place of control and confidence. Now it had become unpredictable, dangerous, and strangely foreign. The Bf-109 pilots, who once prided themselves on their aircraft's agility, found themselves frustrated by how well the Mustang could maintain speed through tight turns. The German fighters could still climb rapidly in short bursts, but the Mustang could sustain performance far longer. In a dive, it was nearly untouchable. American pilots used this to devastating effect, luring their opponents into extended chases and then climbing back up into position while the German aircraft bled energy. The Luftwaffe's tactical doctrines, honed through years of combat experience, were being outmatched by a new breed of fighter and a new philosophy of air combat. The FW-190, beloved by many Luftwaffe pilots for its sturdiness and powerful armament, fared better at lower altitudes, but suffered at high levels where most bomber raids occurred. The Mustangs fought where the air was thin, and the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine thrived there. German pilots found that when they tried to intercept bombers at those heights, the Mustangs would swoop in from even higher positions, striking before they could react. It felt, one veteran later said, like they were waiting for us before we even arrived. For the Luftwaffe leadership, these encounters painted a grim picture. The data pouring in from the front confirmed what pilots were whispering in the mess halls. The Americans had built something exceptional. At first, German intelligence dismissed reports that a single Allied fighter could escort bombers all the way to central Germany. It seemed impossible. But soon, there was no denying it. The evidence came in the form of wreckage, downed Bf-109s and FW-190s, shot down hundreds of miles from the front lines. Morale began to falter. Even among the elite Jagdgeschwader units, once the pride of the Luftwaffe, there was an undercurrent of unease. Pilots no longer looked forward to combat. They dreaded it. The phrase, Achtung, Mustangs above, became synonymous with doom. Young recruits, barely trained, would freeze at those words, knowing what awaited them. The older pilots, who had once mentored them with calm assurance, could only offer grim nods. There was no advice left to give. The Mustangs, meanwhile, seemed to embody the opposite energy, confident, tireless, aggressive. Their pilots were often young too, but they were well-trained, well-equipped, and motivated by a sense of purpose. They flew with the knowledge that their aircraft could take them anywhere and bring them back. To the bomber crews, the P-51 was salvation. To the Luftwaffe, it was a ghost that haunted the skies. Adolf Galland, ever the realist, observed the change not only in the battlefield, but in the spirit of his men. Our pilots were still brave, he wrote, but bravery alone could not win the air. He pleaded with the High Command to focus resources on defending fuel supplies, but the Allies, guided by intelligence and now supported by Mustang squadrons, were systematically destroying them. Every refinery, every depot, every train carrying aviation fuel was targeted. Soon, German pilots could barely afford the fuel for training flights. We had aircraft, Galland noted, but no means to fly them. Gunther Rahl described the helplessness that set in during this period. You would look at your fuel gauge before takeoff, he recalled, and already know how long you could fight before turning back. The Mustangs didn't seem to have that problem. They just kept coming. Rahl was no stranger to adversity. He had fought on both the eastern and western fronts, but the relentless persistence of the Mustangs wore him down. "They had time," he said. "We had only minutes." As the American pilots pressed their advantage, they began flying missions specifically designed to break the Luftwaffe. These were not defensive operations or bomber escorts. They were hunter-killer patrols. The Mustangs flew in pairs or groups of 4, sweeping ahead of the bomber streams, searching for any sign of enemy fighters. When they found them, they attacked with precision and aggression. German pilots who tried to climb for altitude found themselves cut off. Those who tried to retreat to their airfields were often followed and shot down as they approached to land. In this new era of air warfare, the Mustang represented not just speed and firepower, but endurance and strategy. It could outlast the enemy, literally. The Luftwaffe's short-range fighters, bound by fuel constraints, could not remain airborne for long periods, whereas the Mustangs could loiter over German territory, waiting for opportunities. It was a subtle but devastating advantage. Johannes Steinhoff captured the emotional toll in his diary. "The Mustang has changed our war," he wrote. "You no longer fly for victory. You fly for survival." He described the haunting sight of seeing fellow pilots fail to return, their names crossed off flight rosters one by one. Each mission cost more than aircraft. It cost experience, leadership, and morale. "We were losing not just the war," he said, "but the very men who knew how to fight it." By mid-1944, as the Allies prepared for the D-Day invasion, the air situation over Western Europe was firmly in American hands. The Luftwaffe still fought valiantly, but it was fighting on fumes. Mustang groups patrolled relentlessly, ensuring that any German aircraft attempting to interfere with the invasion would be met with overwhelming force. In those crucial weeks, the Luftwaffe's inability to mount an effective response was decisive. The German army on the ground would later curse the absence of air support, but for the pilots, there was no mystery. The Mustangs had made it impossible. Even as the war turned decisively against them, the German aces could not help but admire the machine that had sealed their fate. Walter Schuck, who had once scoffed at American aircraft designs, later spoke of the Mustang with a kind of reverence. "It was beautiful," he said. "You could see the craftsmanship, the thought behind every line. It was not just a fighter. It was an idea made real." In the air, that beauty translated into deadly precision. Mustang pilots were trained to fight as a team, maintaining formation discipline that mirrored the bomber crews they escorted. They learned to trust their wingmen completely, to cover one another during turns and climbs. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, was being forced into chaotic, small-scale engagements with fewer planes and less coordination. Their formations disintegrated under pressure, leaving individual pilots isolated. Against a coordinated flight of Mustangs, isolation was a death sentence. Still, even as the Luftwaffe crumbled, moments of brilliance and courage shone through. There were German pilots who managed to shoot down multiple Mustangs in a single day, who evaded entire squadrons through skill and luck. But these were exceptions. Isolated acts in a battle that was already lost. Each victory only delayed the inevitable. The Mustang's reign was not just a matter of performance, it was timing. It had arrived precisely when the Allies needed it most. The 8th Air Force, previously bleeding pilots and bombers at unsustainable rates, suddenly found itself protected. Losses dropped dramatically. The bombing raids grew more frequent and more effective. Every day, more German factories were destroyed, more fuel supplies burned, more airfields rendered useless. The Luftwaffe was being strangled from the sky. For the men on the ground, watching the contrails high above, it must have seemed almost abstract, a ballet of smoke and flame too distant to grasp. But for those in the cockpits, it was intimate, visceral, and unforgettable. The sound of the Merlin engine roaring past, the flash of sunlight off silver wings, the tracer fire streaking through the clouds, all of it burned into memory. By the time the first Allied troops landed in Normandy, the Luftwaffe's presence over the beaches was almost non-existent. The Mustangs had ensured it. And for the aces who had once ruled those skies, the realization was devastating. They were witnessing the end of their era, the twilight of the Luftwaffe. By the summer of 1944, the Allied juggernaut in the air was unstoppable. Squadrons of P-51 Mustangs filled the skies like a living tide of polished aluminum. Their long-range fuel tanks gave them the endurance to follow the bombers deep into the German heartland and still have enough left to hunt enemy fighters on the way home. For the Luftwaffe, this new reality was like fighting an endless storm. The pilots who had once been the hunters now felt like prey trapped under an open sky. The older generation of Luftwaffe aces tried to adapt. They had survived years of combat on multiple fronts and refused to believe that the skies could truly belong to anyone else. Some of them switched tactics entirely, abandoning traditional interceptions for high-speed dives from extreme altitude. These boom and zoom strikes were meant to catch the Mustangs by surprise, hit hard, and disappear before the Americans could react. But even this strategy faltered as Allied intelligence improved and the Mustang squadrons began to anticipate their movements. The hunters had learned to be hunted, and they were better at it. On the ground, Allied air superiority was beginning to shape the entire course of the war. German convoys moved only at night. Fuel depots and railway lines were obliterated by strafing runs. Every time the Luftwaffe tried to reposition, the Mustangs were there, tearing through columns of trucks and planes parked on the tarmac. Airfields that had once been proud bastions of German power now lay in ruins, littered with charred wrecks and the skeletal remains of hangars. Mechanics scavenged from damaged aircraft just to keep a handful of fighters airworthy. One young German pilot, barely 20, later described his first encounter with the Mustang in stark terms. "I had trained for 3 months," he said, "and had never even fired my guns in combat. When we took off, I was terrified. 10 minutes later, I saw silver planes diving from above, faster than I had ever imagined. My wingman was hit almost immediately. He didn't even have time to cry out." The young man survived by diving into a valley and crash landing in a field. "I never saw them again," he said, "but I can still hear the sound of those engines." That sound, the unmistakable throaty growl of the Merlin, became a symbol of Allied dominance. German civilians could identify it from miles away. For the soldiers below, it was a warning that death might come from the clouds at any moment. The Mustang's roar was the soundtrack of a nation's collapse. Even within the Luftwaffe, the conversations had changed. In 1942, pilots had spoken of tactics, victory, and competition. By 1944, they spoke of survival and inevitability. Johannes Steinhoff wrote in his notes, "We fly because we must, not because we believe." His words captured the grim acceptance spreading among veteran flyers. They were still professionals, disciplined, courageous, but the spark of belief had faded. They were defending a sky that no longer belonged to them. The Mustang squadrons, meanwhile, were refining their art. American pilots developed a ruthless efficiency in the air, using radio coordination and teamwork to dominate engagements. They hunted in pairs, one pilot drawing the enemy's attention while the other swooped in for the kill. The Luftwaffe had pioneered this system years earlier with their rota formations, but now the Americans perfected it, supported by superior communication and tactics. Their radios were clearer, their training more standardized, and their tactics built on collective success rather than individual heroics. In many ways, the Mustang marked the end of the lone wolf ace. The Luftwaffe's great heroes, men who had built reputations on dozens or hundreds of kills, were products of a different age. The Mustang pilots didn't need legends, they needed results. The war was no longer about romantic duels in the sky, but about coordinated destruction. Every mission had purpose: protect the bombers, clear the airspace, destroy the infrastructure. It was systematic, relentless, and coldly effective. Still, there were moments of humanity amid the violence. Mustang pilots often returned from missions shaken by what they had seen. They respected their opponents, sometimes even mourning them. One American pilot, after downing a Bf-109, circled the crash site and saw the German pilot slumped in his cockpit, motionless. "He was about my age," he later said, "maybe 25. I remember thinking, there's no difference between us except the color of our planes." It was a sentiment shared by many who flew those deadly duels, recognition that courage existed on both sides. The Luftwaffe's command structure, once so disciplined, began to unravel under the constant pressure. Adolf Galland's pleas for more autonomy and resources were ignored. The high command still clung to fantasies of new miracle weapons that would turn the tide: jet fighters, rocket planes, even flying bombs. Galland, a realist to the end, knew that none of it mattered if they couldn't control the air. "Technology means nothing without time," he remarked bitterly. "And time is the one thing we no longer have." When the Me-262 jet finally appeared, it was indeed faster and more advanced than anything in the Allied arsenal. but it arrived too late and in too few numbers. The Mustangs, guided by intelligence reports, began targeting Me-262 bases, attacking the jets on takeoff and landing when they were most vulnerable. Even the world's first operational jet fighter couldn't survive without fuel, parts, or safe runways. The Luftwaffe's final months became a grim spectacle. Desperate attempts were made to form new squadrons from what remained of Germany's training schools. Teenagers were rushed into cockpits. Some had never flown solo before being sent into combat. Veterans watched with horror as these boys were massacred within days. Walter Schuck remembered seeing one such unit wiped out in a single afternoon. "They went up full of enthusiasm," he said, "and none returned. We buried them that night beside the airfield." Meanwhile, the Mustang pilots continued their deadly efficiency. They flew multiple sorties a day, striking targets deep in Germany and returning to bases in England or newly liberated France. They were exhausted but victorious. For many, it felt like the world's weight rested on their wings. The faster the Luftwaffe fell, the sooner the war would end. They could see the results of their work below: burning convoys, crumbling railways, cities in flames. The cost was enormous, but the outcome was certain. When American pilots captured Luftwaffe flyers after forced landings, the encounters were often surprisingly respectful. Both sides understood the other's burden. Galland himself, captured near the war's end, was treated with courtesy by Allied officers who had studied his career with admiration. "You were the best," one American colonel reportedly told him. Galland's reply was somber: "Perhaps once. But your Mustangs made sure that time ended." In retrospect, the Mustang's arrival was the perfect storm of technology, timing, and strategy. Its performance was unmatched, but equally important was the infrastructure that supported it: mass production, reliable logistics, skilled maintenance crews, and an endless supply of trained pilots. The Luftwaffe, starved of fuel and manpower, simply couldn't compete. By the end of 1944, its fighter wings were shadows of their former selves, their proud insignias painted on aircraft that rarely made it back from a mission. The German people, too, began to understand what the P-51 represented. The once proud columns of contrails that had marked Luftwaffe patrols were replaced by endless streams of American bombers and their gleaming escorts. Children pointed to them in the sky, not with pride, but with fear. The myth of invincibility was gone. The Mustang had stripped away the illusion that Germany could control its own skies. For the aces who survived into 1945, the memories of those encounters never faded. Gunther Rall, Steinhoff, and Galland would later meet some of their former adversaries after the war. In those reunions, they spoke not of bitterness but of mutual respect. They agreed on one thing: the P-51 Mustang was the finest piston-engine fighter ever built. Rall said it best: "The Mustang did not just win the air war, it ended an age." As 1944 drew to a close, the world above Europe was utterly transformed. The Luftwaffe, once feared for its ferocity and precision, was now a broken force. Its airfields lay in ruin, its factories crippled, and its pilots either dead, captured, or too exhausted to continue. Above them, the Mustangs ruled, unchallenged, unstoppable, a symbol of Allied supremacy. The sky that had once echoed with the staccato bursts of German 20mm cannons now thrummed to the steady hum of Merlin engines, those sleek silver wings glinting like blades in the pale sunlight. To the bomber crews who made their daily runs over Germany, the difference was night and day. Only a year before, every mission into enemy territory had been a gamble with death. Entire bomber groups could vanish in minutes under concentrated Luftwaffe assaults. But by the end of 1944, the tables had turned completely. The Mustangs were everywhere, ahead of the bombers, above them, below them. They were shepherds of the sky, their presence a promise that someone was watching, ready to strike down any enemy that dared approach. For the Luftwaffe, this shift was not merely tactical, it was spiritual. The old confidence, the swagger that had carried them through years of war, had evaporated. What remained was a grim determination to fight on, even in the face of annihilation. Veteran pilots, men who had once soared through the skies of France and Russia with impunity, now flew, knowing the odds were impossible. Yet they still climbed into their cockpits, checked their instruments, and took off into a sky dominated by the enemy. Johannes Steinhoff later wrote that by late 1944, the air was no longer a battlefield, it was a graveyard. He described the feeling of loneliness that crept into every sortie. The once bustling squadrons were now half empty. The briefings that had once been filled with laughter and camaraderie had become silent affairs. Each man knew the truth, that most of them would not return. "We no longer flew for victory," he said. "We flew for the sake of honor." The Mustang pilots, meanwhile, were aware that they were witnessing history. They saw the Luftwaffe's decline firsthand, the dwindling formations, the desperate evasive tactics, the lack of coordination that had once made the German Air Force so formidable. Yet even as the enemy weakened, the Mustang pilots never underestimated them. Many had lost friends to the skill and tenacity of German aces. The Luftwaffe may have been dying, but it was dying with its teeth bared. There were still moments of terror. Mustang pilots spoke of sudden ambushes from FW-190s bursting out of the sun, of deadly head-on passes where both aircraft vanished in fire. Even in its final months, the Luftwaffe could still strike hard. The difference was that now, for every American lost, there were dozens of German aircraft that never returned. The balance of attrition was merciless. Adolf Galland, increasingly disillusioned with the Nazi leadership, tried to hold his forces together. He knew that new aircraft like the Me-262 jet offered hope, but the political chaos of the collapsing regime ensured that such hope was wasted. When Galland was eventually dismissed from his post, it symbolized the end of coherent German air strategy. The Mustang, in its silver inevitability, had rendered all other plans irrelevant. By the start of 1945, Germany's skies belonged entirely to the Allies. The Mustang now flew missions far beyond escort duty. It strafed airfields, trains, supply depots, and convoys. Anything that moved on the ground was fair game. Mustang squadrons roamed the landscape like predators, searching for any target that could hasten the war's end. Pilots joked grimly that if a German bird took flight, someone would probably send a Mustang after it. But behind the bravado, there was fatigue. The men flying these missions were pushing their endurance to the limit. Some had flown hundreds of sorties without rest. They had seen friends shot down in flames, parachutes failing to open, aircraft disintegrating in midair. Yet they kept going, driven by the belief that each mission brought the war closer to an end. In those final months, strange encounters occurred, brief, human moments amid the chaos. Mustang pilots sometimes spotted lone Luftwaffe aircraft flying without insignia, often piloted by desperate men trying to surrender or flee. Occasionally, both sides would break off combat when the futility of the fight became too obvious. A nod through a canopy, a brief wave, gestures of mutual recognition between warriors who had nothing left to prove. Walter Schuck, who had survived countless missions, recalled one such moment vividly. "I was flying alone when I saw a Mustang off my wing. I was out of ammunition. My fuel light was flashing. He could have killed me easily, but he didn't. He just flew beside me for a while, then pulled away and disappeared into the clouds. I don't know who he was, but I'll never forget it." That silent act of mercy captured the strange duality of air combat, the capacity for both destruction and respect. For the Luftwaffe aces who survived, the end came not with a bang, but with exhaustion. By the time American and British forces crossed the Rhine, the German fighter command was in shambles. Some units had no fuel at all, others existed only on paper, their aircraft destroyed or abandoned. When Allied troops captured Luftwaffe bases, they found rows of beautiful but useless machines, Bf-109s, FW-190s, even a few Me-262s, grounded forever by lack of fuel and pilots. To the Mustang crews, flying over these abandoned fields was surreal. They knew that less than 2 years earlier, these same runways had launched some of the deadliest aces in history. Now they were silent, overgrown, forgotten. The great hunters of the Reich had been caged by their own exhaustion, their legend consumed by the relentless logic of attrition. And yet, in the aftermath, even among the victors, there was no sense of triumph in destroying the Luftwaffe. Most Mustang pilots spoke of respect for the skill of their adversaries, for the craftsmanship of their aircraft, and for the courage that had defined both sides. The men who fought in those high-altitude duels shared something few others could understand: the experience of living and dying at the edge of the sky. In the end, the Mustang had done more than defeat an air force. It had redefined what air superiority meant. It was not just about speed or firepower. It was about presence. The Mustang could be everywhere, all the time. It could protect, pursue, and punish with equal precision. It wasn't merely a fighter. It was a symbol of inevitability. As 1945 approached its bloody conclusion, the Luftwaffe's once proud motto, Adler Angriff, Eagle's attack had lost its meaning. The eagles had been driven from the sky. In their place soared a new breed of aviator, flying a machine that represented the industrial might, ingenuity, and determination of a world united against tyranny. Gunther Rahl would later reflect on it with a mixture of melancholy and admiration. "We fought the best," he said, "but they had the better machine. You can be the finest pilot in the world, but if you meet a Mustang in the wrong place on the wrong day, you're finished." That was the truth we all learned, one by one. And that truth marked the end of the Luftwaffe's story and the beginning of the Mustang's legend. When 1945 dawned, Germany's cities were in ruins, its armies in retreat, and its once mighty Luftwaffe reduced to fragments of its former self. Yet above the smoke and rubble, the sky remained alive with motion. For the Mustang pilots, each mission was a grim march toward the inevitable end. They flew with precision and purpose, striking what remained of the German infrastructure. Their silver wings glimmered against the pale winter sun, symbols of a dominance so complete that it almost felt unreal. For the first time in the war, Allied commanders could operate without fear of losing the skies. Every bomber raid, every ground assault, every armored thrust across Europe depended on one simple truth: the Luftwaffe could no longer contest them. The P-51 Mustang had not just defeated the German fighters, it had erased their very capacity to resist. German generals complained bitterly that they could not move troops or supplies without being attacked from above. The skies that once shielded them had turned into open killing grounds. In the Luftwaffe's dwindling bases, despair became routine. The veteran aces who remained tried to teach young pilots the basics of combat flying, but there was no time. The training fields were constantly bombed, and the new recruits were rushed into combat with barely a handful of flight hours. Some didn't even know how to use their radios properly. They climbed into their aircraft with nervous hands, often flying outdated or poorly maintained machines, and faced swarms of Mustangs waiting in the distance. The result was slaughter. Johannes Steinhoff, who had survived the brutal attrition of both the Eastern and Western fronts, described watching his squadrons vanish. "They sent us children," he said, "boys who had never seen combat, told to defend the Reich against impossible odds. The Mustangs showed no mercy because mercy had no place left in that war." He didn't mean cruelty, he meant efficiency. The Americans were fighting to end the war as fast as possible, and they had the tools to do it. The Luftwaffe tried to reorganize around its new jet units, but the Mustang pilots quickly adapted. The Me-262 was fast, so fast that no propeller-driven fighter could catch it in level flight, but its vulnerability during takeoff and landing made it an easy target. The Americans soon began patrolling near jet airfields, striking the Me-262s before they could climb. One Mustang pilot described it as shooting falcons before they can spread their wings. Fuel shortages compounded the disaster. By March 1945, some Luftwaffe airfields received only enough aviation fuel to send up a handful of aircraft each day. Others received none at all. Pilots who had survived years of war now found themselves grounded, watching helplessly as their country burned around them. Galland, ever the pragmatic commander, could only shake his head. "We lost the war," he said, "not for lack of courage, but for lack of fuel." Meanwhile, the Mustang squadrons ranged deeper into Germany than ever before. They struck train stations, bridges, and convoys, disrupting every attempt at organized resistance. The P-51s operated in packs, their movements coordinated by radio intelligence and reconnaissance data. They were not just fighters, they were instruments of systematic destruction. German townsfolk began to recognize their silhouette instantly: the long nose, the bubble canopy, the low whistle that echoed before the strafing run. For many German civilians, the sight of Mustangs overhead was both terrifying and strangely mesmerizing. Some recalled how the sunlight caught their wings, how they moved with the grace of falcons. To the people on the ground, these aircraft represented both doom and inevitability. They were the harbingers of a world that was ending, of a Reich whose glory had turned to ash. Even among the Allied pilots, the mood grew somber. They could see what their victories had done to Germany: the flattened cities, the endless columns of refugees, the devastation stretching from horizon to horizon. Yet they knew it had to be done. Every mission brought the war closer to conclusion, and every Mustang sortie carried that weight. As one pilot said, "We didn't fly for glory. We flew so the killing would finally stop." In April 1945, with Berlin surrounded and the end in sight, the Luftwaffe made one final, desperate effort. A few remaining squadrons took to the air in a futile attempt to repel Allied bombers approaching the capital. It was chaos from the start. The sky filled with smoke trails and flashes of gunfire as the last of the German fighters were swept aside. Mustang pilots who witnessed the battle described it as tragic, a suicide mission carried out by men who refused to surrender their dignity. Gunther Rahl, though no longer in command of an active unit, watched the downfall unfold with heavy resignation. "We had given everything," he said. "The best years of our lives, the finest pilots in the world. But when the Mustangs came, everything changed. We were fighting ghosts." The Mustang's ability to appear anywhere, at any time, gave the impression of infinite power. To the men of the Luftwaffe, it was as if the enemy had become the sky itself. When the war finally ended, the surviving Luftwaffe aces were taken into captivity. Many expected harsh treatment, but to their surprise, they were often met with respect from their captors. The Americans, who had read their names in intelligence reports and war bulletins, saw them as worthy adversaries. Galland, Rahl, and Steinhoff would all later recount how American officers expressed admiration for their skill, even as they acknowledged that the era of the Luftwaffe was over. For the Americans, the P-51 Mustang became the emblem of victory. It was the aircraft that had turned the tide, the guardian of the bombers, the slayer of the Luftwaffe. After the war, pilots spoke of it with reverence. "It was the perfect machine," one veteran said. "If you could fly it, you could win." Even years later, when jet fighters had replaced piston engines, the Mustang retained its aura, a reminder of the moment when technology, courage, and necessity converged to change history. Yet for all its power, the Mustang also inspired something deeper: respect. When captured, Luftwaffe pilots were shown their American counterparts' aircraft, they couldn't help but admire it. They ran their hands along the smooth fuselage, examined the controls, and nodded in silent acknowledgement. "It's beautiful," one said simply. There was no bitterness left, only recognition of greatness. As Europe began to rebuild, those who had fought in the skies found themselves haunted by memories. The airfields, the roar of engines, the smell of oil and cordite, all of it lingered long after the war ended. But among those memories, one image remained above all others: the sleek silver silhouette of the P-51 Mustang cutting through the sky, a symbol of both the war's horror and its conclusion. For the Luftwaffe aces, the Mustang was the final teacher, the one adversary that stripped away illusion and pride, leaving only truth. They had entered the war as masters of the air, confident that nothing could match their skill or machines. They ended it humbled but wiser, their respect for their enemies matched only by their love for flight itself. Johannes Steinhoff would later write, "When I saw a Mustang, I knew the sky belonged to another age. It was the end of our world, but it was also the beginning of something better." When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the world that had once been carved by contrails and cannon fire began to heal. The Luftwaffe, the pride of Hitler's regime, lay in ruin. Its aircraft shattered, its airfields cratered, its legacy tarnished by defeat. Yet among the ruins, a strange kind of reverence remained, shared by both sides. The Luftwaffe pilots, even in captivity, could not forget the sleek silver fighters that had haunted them through the final months. The P-51 Mustang had been their most formidable opponent, the ghost that ended their dominance. In prisoner-of-war camps scattered across Europe, Luftwaffe aces would sit in the fading light, trading stories with one another. The talk always turned to the same topic: the first time they had met the Mustang. Some remembered the shock of being outclimbed, others the humiliation of being outflown. A few recalled near escapes that seemed impossible, and in every story there was the same undertone: not hatred, not resentment, but respect. Adolf Galland, once the symbol of Luftwaffe confidence, was among those who spoke candidly about it. "When the Mustangs came," he told Allied interrogators, "we understood that our time was over. It was not just another aircraft. It was the sign that the future had arrived." His words captured something more profound than a military admission. They were the reflection of a man who had seen the end of an age. The Luftwaffe's story had begun in triumph, with the Blitzkrieg and the Battle of Britain, when their aircraft ruled the skies. But it ended under the shadow of the Mustang, a machine that embodied everything the Allies had learned about modern warfare. It was fast, versatile, and above all, tireless. Unlike the Luftwaffe, it could sustain the fight indefinitely. That was what broke Germany, not just superior machines, but an unending supply of them. For the American pilots, the victory came with mixed emotions. They had fought bravely and won decisively, but few celebrated. Most were simply relieved to have survived. The war had pushed them to their limits, and though the Mustang had given them an edge, it could not shield them from the horrors they had witnessed. They had seen friends vanish in fiery spirals, had watched bombers explode mid-air, had landed on runways lined with burning wrecks. Triumph in the sky had come at a staggering human cost. Chuck Yeager, who would later break the sound barrier and redefine aviation forever, often spoke of those days with humility. "The Mustang was a pilot's dream," he said, "but you never forgot what it meant when you pulled the trigger. You were ending someone's world." His words spoke to the strange brotherhood that existed between the combatants, a shared understanding that courage and tragedy walked hand in hand in the skies. Many Luftwaffe veterans later found themselves working alongside their former enemies. In the years after the war, as West Germany rebuilt, the new Luftwaffe was formed under NATO, and American pilots, many of them Mustang veterans, became its instructors. Men who had once hunted each other now shared meals, traded stories, and flew together under the same flag of peace. The irony was not lost on them. Galland, Rahl, and Steinhoff all played roles in shaping post-war aviation, working closely with their American counterparts. The respect forged in battle had become a foundation for reconciliation. For those who had faced the Mustang in combat, the memories were vivid and often painful. Gunther Rahl recalled the sound of its guns. 650 calibers, all firing in perfect rhythm. You felt it in your bones. He remembered the moment his canopy exploded from a Mustang burst, glass slicing his face as his aircraft spun out of control. He survived, barely, but carried the scars for the rest of his life. And yet, when he spoke of the Mustang years later, there was no bitterness. "It was the perfect fighter," he admitted. "I hated it then, but I admired it always." Walter Schuck had similar memories. "You could never shake them," he said. Even when you thought you had escaped, they would reappear. They hunted in silence, and when they fired, it was over in seconds. He paused, then added quietly, "I have never flown anything that inspired such fear and such respect at the same time." The Mustang's legacy didn't end with the war. It went on to serve in Korea and in dozens of air forces around the world. Its versatility, reliability, and raw performance made it a post-war legend. But even as it transitioned from weapon to icon, its reputation remained tied to that pivotal moment in 1944 and 1945, when it broke the back of the Luftwaffe and secured the skies for the Allies. Historians would later call it the greatest piston-engine fighter ever built. Pilots agreed. The balance between power, agility, and endurance had never been achieved before, and arguably never would be again. The Mustang was, as one engineer put it, the point where the propeller reached perfection. It was the culmination of everything humanity had learned about flight up to that point, and the last great expression of an era before jets changed. Everything. For the Luftwaffe aces, this realization was both humbling and strangely satisfying. They could appreciate excellence when they saw it. After all, they had devoted their lives to mastering the art of aerial combat. To them, the Mustang was not just an enemy. It was an achievement worth acknowledging. Many of them would go on to write memoirs in which they praised the aircraft, describing its sleek beauty and its deadly grace. Their words carried the weight of men who had faced it not as observers, but as survivors. Johannes Steinhoff, reflecting years later, captured it best. "We had built our reputation on being unbeatable," he wrote, "but the Mustang taught us humility. It was not only faster and stronger, it was part of something larger than any of us. It was the machine of an empire of industry, of endless supply, of determination that could not be stopped. Against that, skill alone meant nothing." He was right. The Mustang was not just a product of engineering. It was the embodiment of an idea. It represented what could happen when ingenuity met purpose, when nations worked together toward a single goal. Its success was not the triumph of a single designer or pilot, but of an entire collective effort. And that, perhaps, was its greatest legacy. After the war, when Galland met some of the American pilots who had once flown Mustangs against him, He shook their hands and congratulated them. "You fought well," he said with a faint smile, "and you flew a beautiful machine." One of them replied, "We learned from the best." It was not flattery, it was truth. The Luftwaffe's early dominance had forced the Allies to innovate, to push the limits of design and strategy. In that way, the German aces had indirectly created the very machine that would defeat them. In the end, that was the strange poetry of it all. The Mustang's rise and the Luftwaffe's fall were two sides of the same coin, a story of evolution through conflict, of respect forged in the crucible of war. The men who lived it carried those lessons with them for the rest of their lives. As the decades passed, the Mustang became more than a relic of history. It became a symbol of courage, precision, and transformation. At air shows and memorials, when its engines roared to life and that distinctive whistle filled the air, old men who had once fought beneath those wings would look up, eyes bright with memory. For a moment, time stood still. In the years that followed the war, both the victors and the defeated carried with them a deep respect for the machines that had defined their fates. Among all of them, the P-51 Mustang stood apart, not merely as an aircraft, but as a symbol. Its reputation crossed borders, transcending the politics that had birthed it. Even in post-war Germany, where memories of defeat were still raw, pilots could not help but speak of the Mustang with reverence. They had hated it in battle, yes, but they had also loved it in that unspoken way that only those who understand flight can. The Luftwaffe's surviving aces were scattered across a broken continent. Some became commercial pilots, others engineers or instructors. A few, like Galland and Steinhoff, helped rebuild the German Air Force under NATO. And in those new beginnings, when German and American pilots trained side by side, the name Mustang would inevitably arise. The older German instructors would shake their heads, half smiling, half grimacing. "That plane," they would say, "was the end of us." Yet they said it without bitterness, only respect. Steinhoff once recounted meeting a young American pilot during a NATO exchange in the 1950s. The young man, eager and polite, asked what it had been like to fight against the P-51. Steinhoff laughed softly and said, "It was like trying to fight the wind. You cannot see it coming. You cannot stop it. You only feel it when it hits you." For many Luftwaffe veterans, the Mustang symbolized the difference between their world and the one that replaced it. The Luftwaffe had been built on the ideals of individual heroism, of ace culture, of the lone fighter mastering the sky through instinct and courage. The Mustang represented something else entirely: teamwork, discipline, industry, and overwhelming precision. It was the product of a system, not a single man's genius. And that, more than anything, had sealed the Luftwaffe's fate. Adolf Galland reflected on this years later in his memoirs. "We believed the individual pilot was everything," he wrote. "The Americans believed the machine and the organization were everything." In the end, they were right. That was a hard truth for a man like Galland to admit. He had built his career on instinct and personal excellence, yet he could not deny what he had seen. The Mustang, backed by the full power of Allied industry, had proven that modern war was not won by heroes alone. In the post-war decades, air shows became living memorials to the machines that had once filled the skies. The Mustang's distinctive silhouette would appear at these gatherings, its polished wings catching the sunlight just as they had over Germany decades before. Old Luftwaffe pilots would stand among the crowds, sometimes unnoticed, watching silently. The sound of the Merlin engine stirred something deep inside them. Not fear anymore, but nostalgia. They had spent their youth fighting that sound, and now it had become the soundtrack of their memories. Gunther Rahl, who lived well into his 90s, was often invited to aviation events where restored Mustangs performed. He never missed an opportunity to speak about them. "You must understand," he would tell younger audiences, "we did not hate those pilots. We respected them. They fought with skill and honor. The Mustang was their sword, and it was sharp indeed." He often paused before adding, "When I see one now, I feel no anger, only admiration. Because when you have faced the best and survived, you never forget." For American veterans, the feeling was similar. They, too, had seen enough death to strip away any illusion of glory. To them, the Mustang was not just a war machine, it was a companion, a protector, almost a living thing. Pilots often described their aircraft as if they were partners in battle. "You talked to it," one said. "You trusted it, like you'd trust a brother." There was something about the Mustang's design that inspired that kind of loyalty. It wasn't just its speed or its range, but its grace. It could climb like a rocket, yet it handled like silk. Pilots said that once you strapped into a Mustang, you never wanted to fly anything else. It felt alive, responsive, intuitive, a perfect extension of the pilot's will. That sense of connection wasn't lost on the Luftwaffe pilots who fought against it. Many of them later admitted that the Mustang's combination of beauty and lethality made it unforgettable. "It was elegant," Walter Schuck said, "even when it was killing you." Those words, harsh and honest, reflected the strange duality of air combat, the simultaneous terror and awe that came with facing a worthy opponent. As time passed, the Mustang's legend grew. It became the aircraft most associated with the Allied victory in Europe, its name evoking both triumph and sacrifice. Museums displayed it as a symbol of freedom, while filmmakers immortalized its sleek profile in countless documentaries and movies. Yet behind the legend, the human stories endured. Stories of courage, loss, and mutual respect. For the Luftwaffe aces, time softened the edges of memory. The bitterness of defeat faded, replaced by gratitude for survival. They came to see their experiences not as a tale of loss, but as part of something larger, the evolution of flight itself. They had been witnesses to the peak of propeller-driven warfare, the last dance of the piston engine before jets took over. And in that final act, the Mustang had taken center stage. Johannes Steinhoff once visited an airfield in England where a restored P-51 was being maintained. As he walked along the tarmac, he ran his hand along the wing's cool metal, tracing the lines of rivets with quiet reverence. The mechanics nearby recognized him and watched silently. After a long moment, he said, almost to himself, "This machine beat us. But what a beautiful way to lose." Those words captured something universal about the pilots of that era, the ability to find grace even in defeat. They were warriors, yes, but also craftsmen and dreamers, bound by their love of flight. For them, the sky was both battlefield and sanctuary, a place where ideology faded and only skill and courage mattered. When Luftwaffe aces spoke of their first encounters with the Mustang, the emotion in their voices never faded with time. It was always the same mixture of awe and inevitability, the realization that they had met something greater than themselves. "It was like seeing the future," one pilot said, "and knowing it didn't belong to you." By the late 20th century, many of those who had fought in that great aerial struggle had passed away. Yet their words, their memoirs, and their interviews preserved the memory of that moment, when silver wings crossed the skies of Europe, and everything changed. The Mustang had not just ended an air war, it had ended an era. And even now, decades later, when the few remaining Mustangs take flight at dawn, the world still stops to listen. The deep, rolling growl of the Merlin engine echoes across the airfield, and those who understand, those who remember, feel a shiver down their spine. Because that sound, that song of victory and sorrow, belongs to the moment when courage met technology, and history was decided in the endless blue above Europe. For those who lived through it, the meeting of the Luftwaffe and the Mustang wasn't just a military encounter, it was a human story. It was a collision of belief systems, of philosophies of flight, of two generations of aviators who had grown up with the conviction that their courage could shape the world. The Germans had once believed that mastery of the air was an art, a duel between skilled individuals. The Americans brought a new idea that mastery could be engineered, multiplied, perfected through teamwork and machinery. The moment those two visions met above Europe, the future of aerial warfare was decided. In early 1944, when the first long-range P-51 escort missions began, few Luftwaffe pilots grasped what was coming. They thought it was just another rotation of Allied aircraft. But within weeks, the reports began to tell the story. These new American fighters didn't turn back. Even deep over Germany, far from England, they were still there, circling, waiting, watching. For the first time, Luftwaffe pilots realized that their home skies were no longer theirs. "We had nowhere left to run," one German ace later said. "They followed us everywhere." The psychological toll of that realization was immense. German pilots, who had once taken pride in being the aggressors, found themselves constantly defending. The initiative, that precious element of air combat, had been lost. Every climb to intercept a bomber formation felt like stepping into a trap. Even before visual contact, radio chatter would fill with warnings. Mustangs above, Mustangs behind. They were ghosts, omnipresent and relentless. To the Americans, the mission seemed simple, but it was grueling. Escorting bombers across the continent required hours of high-altitude flying in freezing temperatures. The pilots sat in cramped cockpits, oxygen masks frosting over, scanning the endless blue for tiny specks that might be enemy aircraft. When combat came, it happened in bursts, seconds of chaos and adrenaline, followed by long, lonely flights back home. And yet every man knew that his presence up there meant survival for hundreds of bomber crews. The Mustangs weren't just fighting, they were protecting. Those bomber crews, trapped in their roaring, vibrating fortresses, learned to recognize the sight of the Mustangs as the purest form of relief. A silver shape cutting across the contrails, wings flashing in the sunlight. It meant they were not alone. One B-17 gunner described it as seeing angels. He said, "When the Mustangs appeared, we stopped praying. We knew we were going to make it home." For the Luftwaffe, that same sight meant the opposite. The silver wings gleaming against the blue sky became the harbinger of doom. Pilots who had once relished the chase now prayed not to be spotted. Those who were caught rarely lived long enough to regret it. The Mustang's speed, range, and firepower made it nearly unbeatable once it had the advantage. And its pilots had learned how to make every advantage count. There were still Luftwaffe aces who managed to down Mustangs, sometimes several in a single day. But these victories, once common in the early years of the war, had become Pyrrhic. Every German success was answered with overwhelming American retaliation. Entire airfields were wiped out in response to isolated attacks. The Luftwaffe could win battles, but the Americans were winning the war of numbers. Adolf Galland, watching from his command post, saw it unfold with the eyes of a realist. He admired the Mustang not only for its technical excellence, but for what it represented, the culmination of Allied adaptability. "They learned faster than we did," he admitted, "and when they built something better, they built thousands of them." The German system, crippled by shortages and politics, simply couldn't compete. By the final months of 1944, the Luftwaffe's defeat was no longer a matter of strategy or bravery. It was mathematics. The Americans could field 10 Mustangs for every German fighter that made it into the air. The balance had shifted irreversibly. "You could shoot down 2, 3, even 5 of them," one pilot said, "but there were always more." The Mustangs didn't just dominate the air, they began to own the ground too. Their long-range fuel and versatility made them perfect for low-altitude attacks. They hunted trains, trucks, and airfields, turning the Luftwaffe's logistical lifelines into rubble. German pilots who survived dogfights often found their bases destroyed when they tried to land. The feeling of futility grew heavier by the day. Yet even as defeat closed in, the Luftwaffe's veterans fought on with astonishing resolve. To them, flying was more than duty. It was identity. "The sky was our last refuge," Steinhoff wrote. "We could lose everything else, but as long as we could fly, we were still free." That defiance, that stubborn, almost poetic commitment to flight, earned them the respect of their enemies. Mustang, pilots spoke of their adversaries with admiration. "Those German boys could fly," said one American ace. "You never saw panic in them. They came at you straight, even when the odds were hopeless." The duels that took place in the icy air above Germany were fought with intensity, but also a strange sense of fraternity. Each pilot, whether German or American, knew that the other was bound by the same code: to fight well, to fight fair, and to survive if fate allowed. Sometimes, after a particularly fierce engagement, Mustang pilots would return to base silent. There were no cheers, no boasting. They had seen their enemies explode in midair, sometimes at distances so close that the shockwave rattled their own cockpits. The war had stripped away all illusions of glory. What remained was respect and exhaustion. Among the Luftwaffe, stories began to circulate of pilots who, after being shot down, met their Mustang opponents in captivity and shared cigarettes, trading stories of the same battle from opposite sides. These encounters revealed how thin the line was between enemy and ally when stripped of flags and orders. They were all young men who had chosen the same path: to fly, to fight, and to live for the few minutes each day when the sky belonged to them. In the years after the war, as veterans gathered at reunions and air shows, those stories took on the weight of legend. They became symbols of mutual respect, proof that even in the darkest times, humanity could persist. Galland once said at a veterans gathering, "We were enemies, but we were also brothers of the sky." The room, filled with both former Luftwaffe and American pilots, fell silent. They all understood. The Mustang, once a machine of war, had become a bridge. It connected men who had once tried to kill each other, men who later stood shoulder to shoulder as friends. Its sleek design and roaring engine reminded them not only of what they had lost, but of what they had learned, that courage knows no nation, and that respect can outlive hatred. Even today, when a Mustang takes off and its propeller spins up to that familiar resonant whine, it carries with it the memory of that moment, when the Luftwaffe aces first faced it and realized they were witnessing the future. It was not just the end of their dominance, it was the dawn of a new world. For them, it was a shock, a heartbreak, and strangely, a revelation. For us, it remains a story of courage, meeting progress, of men who, despite being on opposite sides of history, found honor in each other's skill. The sky they fought for no longer belongs to nations, but to all who remember what it costs to claim it. The closing months of the war were a paradox of extremes. The skies, once crowded with dueling squadrons and roaring engines, began to empty. The Luftwaffe was still there, but in fragments. Isolated units, pockets of resistance that rose briefly and were torn apart by swarms of Mustangs before they could even form up. For Allied pilots, the missions no longer felt like hunts, they felt like cleanup operations. The thrill of combat had faded, replaced by the cold efficiency of dominance. And yet, for many Mustang pilots, that dominance came with an uncomfortable weight. They knew they were witnessing not only victory, but the extinction of a generation of flyers who had once ruled the sky. The German aces they faced were not villains to them. They were professionals, warriors. "We respected them more than anyone else," said an American pilot years later. "They were the best, and we beat them, but it didn't feel like beating the enemy. It felt like beating history itself." For the Luftwaffe pilots still flying, each sortie was a last stand. Their airfields were little more than mud and debris, their aircraft patched together from scavenged parts. But still, they flew. Even when the odds were impossible, even when the sky above Germany swarmed with Allied fighters, they climbed into their cockpits and took off. "We knew we would not come back," one veteran later said, "but to not fly, that would have been worse." Johannes Steinhoff's final missions were flown under such conditions. He recalled the silence of the pre-dawn hours as the last few serviceable planes were prepared for flight. "The ground crew worked without speaking," he wrote. "They all knew what was coming. We had no illusions anymore." When he taxied down the runway, the world seemed frozen, the air heavy with resignation. Above him, the contrails of Allied bombers stretched endlessly, and somewhere among them, the silver shadows of Mustangs circled like sentinels. The Mustang's reputation by then was so fearsome that even the mention of its presence could disrupt German operations. Ground controllers began to rely on deception, using false radio traffic to make the enemy think the skies were clear. But the Mustangs always came. They appeared suddenly, as if conjured out of the sun, striking with precision before fading back into the blue. "They were everywhere," one Luftwaffe officer said. "You could not look up without expecting to see them." The Luftwaffe's once proud hierarchy had broken down entirely by that point. There were no longer elite formations, no longer meticulously planned strategies. The aces who had once set records for victories now flew alongside boys barely out of training school. Some were only 16 or 17, eager but hopelessly unprepared. The veterans did what they could to protect them, often sacrificing themselves in the attempt. Many Mustangs that returned from missions had no bullet holes at all. The Germans rarely even got close enough to fire. For the American pilots, these encounters became increasingly one-sided, but they never grew easier. They could see the desperation of their opponents. They could see that the war was over, even if the fighting wasn't. One Mustang pilot described chasing a lone Bf-109 across the sky for several minutes before finally disabling it. As the German pilot bailed out, the Mustang circled him gently, following his descent. "He looked up at me and saluted," the American said softly. "I saluted back." Moments like that defined the final weeks of the air war. There was no hatred left, only understanding. Both sides were exhausted, both knew the end was near, and yet both refused to stop. It wasn't ideology that drove them anymore, but a kind of loyalty to the sky itself. They were pilots to the end, bound by their shared love of flight. Adolf Galland, grounded by injury and disillusionment, watched as his country fell apart. "We had become ghosts," he said. "Our aircraft still flew, but our spirit was gone." Even so, he took a kind of grim satisfaction in seeing the Mustang up close after the war. When Allied officers showed him one at a captured airfield, he walked around it slowly, studying every detail. "Magnificent," he murmured. "If I had had one of these, I would have won the Battle of Britain." It was not bitterness, it was admiration. In truth, Galland's words were not far from the truth. The Mustang's combination of speed, range, and stability would have changed the outcome of any air campaign. Its ability to escort bombers deep into enemy territory without sacrificing agility was revolutionary. It had effectively rendered the old tactics of interception obsolete. Once the Mustangs took control of the sky, the concept of safe airspace for the Axis ceased to exist. For German civilians, the sight of them had become routine. They no longer ran to shelters at the first engine hum. They simply looked up, recognized the silver silhouettes, and accepted that the war was beyond saving. For the younger generation, those aircraft became their first vision of defeat and of a strange, distant beauty. "We hated them," one woman later said, "but we couldn't stop watching them. They were so graceful, like birds that didn't know how to fall." Meanwhile, in the Allied camps, Mustang crews were already looking beyond the war. Many of them sensed that they were witnessing the end of an era. Jet engines were being tested, radar-guided weapons developed. The age of propeller-driven fighters was fading fast. The P-51, though still unmatched, was the last of its kind, a masterpiece at the peak of its technology, about to be overtaken by progress. "It was the last time man and machine were truly one," Chuck Yeager later said. After that, the machines started doing the thinking. For the Luftwaffe aces who survived, that thought brought a certain melancholy. They had lived through the golden age of flight, when victory or death depended not on buttons or systems, but on instinct and reflex, on the raw connection between pilot and aircraft. The Mustang had perfected that balance, but it had also ended it. "We saw the last great dance of the propeller," Gunther Rahl reflected. After that, the music stopped. By May 1945, the war was over. The last remnants of the Luftwaffe surrendered their aircraft, some intact, others half buried in mud and snow. The Americans inspected them with curiosity, even respect. Many Mustang pilots felt a pang of sadness as they walked among those captured German fighters. They had fought these machines, feared them once, and now they lay still, silent witnesses to a vanished age. In the years to come, the P-51 Mustang would become a legend, not only because of its victories, but because of what it represented, the transition from one world to another. It was the bridge between the old and the new, between chivalry and industrial warfare. And those who faced it, those Luftwaffe aces who once ruled the sky, knew it better than anyone. For them, seeing the Mustang for the first time had been like watching the dawn break over a battlefield, a moment of awe and dread, of beauty and finality. They knew, even as they fought it, that they were witnessing the future take flight, and though it defeated them utterly, it earned their eternal respect. After the surrender, the world that had been consumed by fire began to quiet. The airfields that once trembled with the roar of engines fell silent. The skies, once streaked with contrails, now soft and empty. Yet for those who had lived their lives in those skies, the silence was not peace. It was memory. The Luftwaffe aces, who had once soared with confidence and pride, found themselves grounded, prisoners, observers, or, in time, instructors in a world that no longer needed them. And always, when they spoke of their war, the Mustang was there, haunting their recollections like a ghost of silver and thunder. For the Americans, the P-51 was a triumph that defined their generation. It had delivered them air supremacy, protected their bombers, and crippled the Luftwaffe beyond recovery. But it also became something more intimate, a personal companion to those who flew it. Mustang pilots described the aircraft not as a tool, but as a friend, an extension of themselves. She felt alive, one veteran said. You could feel her mood through the stick. When she wanted to climb, she'd leap. When she wanted to turn, you just thought about it, and she was already there. That connection between man and machine was what made the P-51 so special. It didn't simply perform, it responded. Every vibration, every whisper of air over the canopy spoke to the pilot. At high speed, it was steady as a rock. At low speed, graceful as a bird. It could escort bombers at 30,000 feet and still dive after ground targets with lethal precision. It was the machine that could do everything, and do it beautifully. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, had begun the war with the same sense of partnership between pilot and aircraft. The Bf-109 and FW-190 were masterpieces of design in their own right, light, agile, deadly. But by 1944, those aircraft were relics of an earlier philosophy. They had been designed for short, fast fights near home bases, not for the endless battles of attrition that the war had become. When the Mustang appeared, it broke every rule the Germans had built their tactics upon. The enemy could now reach them anywhere, stay as long as it liked, and return unscathed. We had lost the advantage of place, said Walter Schuck. That was everything. For young Luftwaffe recruits, the Mustang became an almost mythical adversary. In training briefings, they were told its weaknesses, how to attack from below, how to use its wide turn radius against it. But in practice, few ever got close enough to try. Most of them never saw a Mustang until it was already firing. The veterans tried to teach courage, but courage could not compensate for experience. They were boys, Steinhoff said sadly. Good boys, but too young. The war had taken their teachers. As the months passed, the Mustang became more than a weapon. It became the symbol of inevitability. German pilots saw them in their dreams. They could hear the engine before they saw it, the deep, rolling growl of the Merlin, growing louder until the canopy shook. For some, that sound became the embodiment of defeat itself. It was the music of the end, one Luftwaffe sergeant said. When we heard it, we knew the war had come for us. And yet, paradoxically, that same sound inspired respect. There was something almost noble in the way the Mustang flew. Its poise, its balance, its power harnessed to purpose. Even its enemies couldn't deny its beauty. The Luftwaffe's engineers, after examining captured Mustangs, were astonished by the craftsmanship. The laminar flow wings, the aerodynamic lines, the perfect balance of weight and control. All of it revealed a design philosophy that was years ahead. One German test pilot reportedly said, "It flies like a thought, no resistance, no hesitation." Adolf Galland, when shown a P-51 after the war, ran his fingers along its polished fuselage and smiled faintly. "This," he said, "is what every fighter should have been." He wasn't simply admiring an enemy aircraft. He was acknowledging an idea. The Mustang represented everything the Luftwaffe had once aspired to: speed, grace, and the ability to shape the outcome of a battle through mastery of the air. But it also symbolized something deeper: the triumph of organization and innovation over arrogance and isolation. By contrast, the Luftwaffe's downfall had been inevitable the moment Germany lost control of its own skies. Factories were bombed, fuel supplies dwindled, and the very airfields needed for defense were destroyed. Mustang squadrons roamed freely, attacking anything that moved. They crippled the transport networks that fed the front lines and cut off retreating columns from supplies. The war on the ground had become unwinnable long before the tanks reached Berlin, because above them the sky had already fallen. For the Mustang pilots, there was a strange kind of melancholy in victory. They had trained their entire lives for combat, and now that the war was ending, they found themselves longing for the very challenge that had once terrified them. "It's strange," one pilot said after VE Day. "You fight to survive, and when you finally stop fighting, you miss it. You miss the sky, the adrenaline, even the danger." The war had changed them forever. The world below felt smaller now, quieter, almost unreal. In those first months of peace, many of the surviving Luftwaffe aces were interrogated by Allied intelligence officers. The Americans wanted to understand how the Germans had built such skilled pilots, how they had maintained morale under impossible odds. But inevitably, the conversations turned to the Mustang. "What did you think when you first saw it?" the Americans would ask. And time after time, the answers were the same. Shock, disbelief, admiration. It was fast, too fast, one German said. You could not run from it. It climbed like a god. Another added, when it turned toward you, you knew you had already lost. You fought anyway, but only because you must. These were not words of defeat. They were words of respect. The Luftwaffe's aces had been the finest in the world once, and they recognized greatness when they saw it. To them, the Mustang was not an insult, but a worthy successor. If I had been born American, Rahl once joked, I would have wanted to fly one. That acknowledgement became the quiet thread connecting the post-war brotherhood of aviators. The men who had once been enemies found that they understood each other better than anyone else ever could. They had all danced on the edge of death, and they had all felt the same wind, the same terror, the same awe. When you have fought in the sky, Galland said, you are brothers forever, no matter which flag you wore. As decades passed and the old rivals grew gray, they began to appear together at commemorations and air shows, standing side by side in front of gleaming Mustangs, restored to perfection. The same aircraft that had once been symbols of destruction had become monuments to shared history. The crowd would watch as the engine started, that familiar rumble building into a roar, and the old men would smile, not in triumph, but in remembrance. The Mustang, they knew, had been more than a machine. It had been a messenger of change, a herald of a new kind of war, and a mirror reflecting the best and worst of humanity's genius. For the Luftwaffe aces who first faced it, it was a revelation wrapped in aluminum, a reminder that courage alone was not enough, and that progress, once unleashed, could not be stopped. As the years rolled on, the echoes of that conflict faded from the skies, but not from memory. For those who had faced each other above Europe, the P-51 Mustang remained a constant companion in their recollections, a glimmer of silver light that had cut across the darkest days of their youth. The old Luftwaffe asses spoke of it often, sometimes with a rueful smile, sometimes with a quiet sadness that only fellow aviators could understand. Johannes Steinhoff, who had survived being shot down multiple times and later helped rebuild the post-war German Air Force, often told young pilots that the Mustang had changed his life more than any other enemy. It taught me humility, he said. It showed me what happens when the world moves forward and you do not. In those few words, he captured the essence of what the Luftwaffe had faced, a confrontation not merely with another air force, but with the future itself. For the German veterans, remembering the Mustang was a complicated emotion. It represented their defeat, yet it also embodied everything they had once loved about flying. It was fast, elegant, responsive, the perfect aircraft. When they saw it at post-war air shows, gleaming under the sunlight, it felt almost like meeting an old rival turned friend. When I hear that engine, said Walter Schuck, I do not think of war. I think of youth, of courage, of how alive we all were. That feeling of kinship extended across borders. Former Mustang pilots, too, looked back on those encounters with deep respect. Many admitted that the Luftwaffe aces had been the finest opponents they ever faced. You could always tell when you were up against a German veteran, one American said. They fought with skill and grace, even when they were doomed. You couldn't help admiring that. By the 1950s and 1960s, as the jet age matured, the old propeller fighters became relics, replaced, stored, or scrapped. But the Mustang refused to vanish. It found new life in civilian hands, racing through desert skies and performing at shows. Its sound, the unmistakable whine of the Merlin engine, became a bridge between generations. When it flew overhead, people would stop what they were doing and look up, just as they had during the war. But now the sound brought fascination instead of fear. Some of the very men who had once fought against it helped restore those planes. German engineers and mechanics who had worked on the Bf-109s and FW-190s lent their expertise to museums and collectors who sought to keep the old fighters alive. They did so not out of nostalgia for battle, but out of love for the craftsmanship of flight. The Mustang deserves to fly, one former Luftwaffe technician said. It was built to be free. The more the world changed, the more people looked back on the Mustang as a symbol of a vanished age, the last era when flight was personal, tactile, almost romantic. Before missiles and computers, victory in the air depended on a pilot's nerve and instinct, on his bond with his machine. The Luftwaffe aces had embodied that ideal. and in the Mustang they saw the final, perfected expression of it. It was as if destiny itself had chosen that sleek, silver shape to close the chapter on human flight as an art. Adolf Galland, who had once commanded the entire German fighter force, grew philosophical in his later years. When asked what he thought of the P-51, he said, "It was a beautiful thing, but terrible too. Beautiful because it showed what man could achieve. Terrible because it showed what war could do with such achievement." He paused, then added softly, "But if I had to be defeated by anything, I'm glad it was that airplane." For the American pilots, the end of the war did not end the bond they shared with their Mustangs. Many continued to fly in civilian life, unable to give up the sensation of the controls in their hands. Some bought surplus P-51s after the war, painting their old squadron markings on the fuselage. To them, flying those aircraft in peacetime felt like reclaiming something pure from the fire. "It was freedom again," said one pilot. "No bombers to guard, no enemies to fight, just the sky and the sound of the Merlin." Over the decades, reunions between former enemies became moments of quiet reconciliation. In one famous meeting, Galland, Steinhoff, and Rahl stood beside American veterans like Bud Anderson and Chuck Yeager. They shared drinks, traded jokes, and posed for photographs with a gleaming P-51 parked behind them. To the crowd, it looked like a moment of friendship. To the men themselves, it was something deeper, a circle closing. The machine that had once divided them now united them. When those old pilots spoke publicly, they rarely glorified combat. Instead, they talked about flying, the pure joy of mastering the air. They spoke of the wind buffeting the canopy, the glint of sunlight on wings, the split-second decisions that separated life from death. And always, somewhere in those stories, the Mustang appeared, silent, swift, inevitable. "It was our measure," said Rahl. "If you could survive a Mustang, you had earned your place in the sky." By the late 20th century, the P-51 had become a living artifact, not of destruction, but of excellence. Museums displayed it as an icon of engineering, a testament to what humanity could build even amid chaos. In documentaries and books, it symbolized the turning point of the air war, the moment when the hunter became the hunted. But to the men who had been there, it remained something simpler, a memory of youth, of courage tested, of a time when the world seemed both infinite and fragile. Even the public, removed from the realities of war, could sense its aura. When a restored Mustang thundered over a crowd, children would cover their ears while their parents stared in awe. For a few seconds, history came alive again. The silver flash across the blue sky, the echo of power that once decided the fate of nations. In those moments, everyone could feel a trace of what the Luftwaffe asses had felt on that first day. Wonder and fear in equal measure. As the veterans aged, they grew increasingly reflective. Many spoke openly about the futility of the conflict, about how admiration for the enemy had replaced hatred long ago. "The war taught us nothing lasts," Steinhoff said late in life, "but it also taught us that beauty can exist even in ruin." The Mustang was proof of that. When he died, his family found among his papers a sketch of a P-51, simple pencil lines drawn with care. Below it, in German, he had written, "Sie hat den Himmel gewonnen." She won the sky. That phrase would come to define the story of the Mustang and the men who faced it. It wasn't just about victory or defeat. It was about the end of an era when flight itself was the highest form of courage. The Luftwaffe aces had lived to see that era's final masterpiece, and though it had taken everything from them, they could not help but love it. And so, as the last of them faded into history, the memory remained. The first encounter with the Mustang, the disbelief, the awe, the understanding that they were witnessing something greater than themselves. It was the moment when they looked up and saw the silver wings glinting in the sun, and knew, with a mixture of dread and admiration, that the sky they had once ruled was no longer theirs. As time carried the world further from the thunder of that war, the stories of those encounters took on a quieter, more reflective tone. What had once been the stuff of battle reports and kill tallies became memories told to grandchildren, historians, and film crews. The Luftwaffe aces who had faced the Mustangs began to speak of those days not as soldiers recalling glory, but as old men remembering youth. Their voices softened when they spoke of the P-51. Their eyes, even after decades, still glimmered with the awe they had felt the first time they saw those polished wings slicing through the sky. Gunther Rall, whose name had once commanded fear and respect across Europe, often said that the greatest compliment he could pay an aircraft was that it made you forget you were fighting it. That was how he felt about the Mustang. It wasn't just an enemy machine, he said in an interview. It was beautiful, graceful. When you saw one in sunlight, you couldn't hate it. You just respected it. And then, you tried not to die. By the 1970s, aviation historians were collecting every surviving story, and the testimonies from both sides painted the same picture of awe, fear, and respect. German pilots spoke of their shock at the Mustang's range, how it could escort bombers from England to Berlin and still fight on the way home. American pilots described how it felt to know they finally had an aircraft that could meet the Luftwaffe on equal terms, and then surpass it. Each side remembered those duels as something pure, something separate from the chaos below. In the sky, it was just man against man, skill against skill, and the Mustang was the equalizer that defined it. Some Luftwaffe veterans even admitted that deep down, the appearance of the Mustang brought relief. The war had dragged on too long, and the writing had been on the wall since Stalingrad. "When I saw the first Mustangs over Germany," said one former Bf-109 pilot, "I knew we were finished, but I also knew the end would come faster." There was a strange comfort in that. For the Americans, too, the Mustang symbolized closure. After years of heavy losses to German fighters, the tide had finally turned. Escorting the bombers deep into enemy territory was no longer a suicide mission. Pilots returned from missions alive, and entire squadrons celebrated the newfound control they had over the air. The once terrifying German skies now belonged to them, yet victory came at a price. "You started feeling pity," recalled a Mustang ace. "You saw them burning, parachuting, dying, and you realized they were boys, same as you. They were just on the wrong side of the sky." That understanding, that shared sorrow between enemies, became the defining legacy of those encounters. The war had forced these men into opposite cockpits, but time had revealed how similar they truly were. Each had felt the same fear, the same rush, the same responsibility. The Mustang, in a way, had united them in mutual respect long before peace did. In Germany, post-war aviation magazines began publishing memoirs of former Luftwaffe aces, many of which devoted whole chapters to describing the P-51. The tone was always the same, admiration tinged with melancholy. Johannes Steinhoff wrote that, "The Mustang did not simply defeat us, it replaced us." He meant that it had ushered in a new kind of pilot, one who fought as part of a machine larger than himself. It was the end of the lone hero and the beginning of modern warfare. "We were the last eagles," he wrote. "The Mustangs were the dawn." Adolf Galland echoed that sentiment when he wrote of his final days commanding the Luftwaffe. "When I looked up and saw those silver fighters covering the sky, I felt both despair and admiration. They were everything we had once dreamed of creating, and they were ours only in defeat." Galland had been a romantic about flight all his life, and his respect for the Mustang never dimmed. "It was the most perfect propeller fighter ever built," he declared in his memoirs. And it arrived at the moment when the world no longer needed propellers. As the decades passed, the Mustang transcended its wartime origins. It became a symbol not of conflict, but of possibility. Children read about it in books, saw it on museum floors, and heard its story told by the men who had lived it. For the Germans, it was the aircraft that had ended their era. For the Americans, it was the one that had defined theirs. And for everyone who loved flight, it was proof that human ingenuity could create something timeless, even amid destruction. At air shows, when restored Mustangs took to the skies, the crowds would always fall silent for a moment as that sound, the low growl of the Merlin, filled the air. The veterans, frail now, would lift their heads and follow it with their eyes. Some smiled, others wept. They could see their youth in that shimmer of aluminum, feel the years fall away. The young pilots of the modern world could only imagine what those men had felt, the mix of terror and admiration, of loss and wonder. But for the old aces, it was all still there. Walter Schuck attended one such show late in his life. Standing beside a P-51 painted in wartime colors, he placed a hand on its fuselage and said quietly, "I spent years trying to destroy you, and now I would give anything to fly you." The crowd nearby fell silent. It wasn't a speech, it was a confession, an acknowledgement of the strange, enduring bond between enemies who had shared the same sky. In those twilight years, the Luftwaffe aces spoke less about who won or lost. They talked instead about what they had witnessed, the transformation of flight itself. The Mustang had marked the end of a dream that began with wooden biplanes and scarves fluttering in the wind. It was the final expression of a time when human hands and hearts still guided every turn, every climb. After that, Rahl said, the machines took over. He was not lamenting progress, only recognizing that something precious had been left behind. The war had been horrific, but for those who lived through it, flying had been pure. The Mustang symbolized that purity, even in defeat. It was a weapon, yes, but also an artwork, a reminder that beauty could exist even in the darkest of times. And so, as history turned its pages and the last of the old flyers faded away, the story of their first encounters with the Mustang remained one of the most poignant chapters in aviation lore. It wasn't just about victory or loss, technology or tactics. It was about what happens when men dedicated to mastery face the unstoppable march of change and find grace in acknowledging it. For the Luftwaffe aces, seeing the Mustang for the first time was like watching the future arrive on silver wings. It took their skies, their dominance, their pride. But in doing so, it left them something enduring. The knowledge that they had lived through one of history's great turning points and had seen firsthand the moment when the world looked up and realized that the sky had been conquered forever. By the time the last generation of wartime pilots entered their twilight years, their memories had become a kind of living museum. To speak with them was to open a window into a vanished sky, one filled with courage, smoke, and the gleam of sunlight on aluminum. When they spoke of their encounters with the P-51 Mustang, their voices carried the weight of history and the softness of reflection. It had been, for them, the moment when the familiar world of flight turned into something new and unstoppable. In the decades that followed the war, aviation evolved at a pace none of them could have imagined. Jets shrieked across the stratosphere, missiles replaced guns, and computerized systems began to do the work once done by human instinct. But for the men who had fought above Europe, none of it could eclipse the memory of those battles where a man's courage and a machine's capability decided everything. And in those memories, the Mustang reigned supreme. Gunther Rahl once said that the first time he saw a P-51 diving through a formation of German fighters, he realized that the sky was no longer ours. That phrase would become emblematic of the Luftwaffe's last stand, not bitter, but resigned, spoken with the grace of a man who could admire what had defeated him. When he met American pilots years later, he shook their hands, not as enemies, but as equals. "We were all part of the same story," he said. "We just saw it from different sides of the sun." That shared understanding became one of the great legacies of the air war. The men who had once tried to destroy one another came to see that they were united by something stronger than nationality, the brotherhood of flight. The Mustang, in its way, was the meeting point of that brotherhood, the aircraft that had brought them together through opposition and later through mutual admiration. At gatherings of veterans in the 1980s and 1990s, the sight of a Mustang flying overhead could still hush a crowd. The old German pilots would look up and smile wistfully, while the Americans stood beside them, hands shading their eyes. Some would speak quietly to each other, retelling stories that had been told 1,000 times. The dogfight over Berlin, the desperate chase through cloud, the escape that almost wasn't. The details blurred with age, but the feeling never faded. Johannes Steinhoff, in one of his last interviews, reflected on how the Mustang had changed not only the war, but also his understanding of it. "It was not the machine alone that defeated us," he said. "It was the spirit behind it, the unity, the resolve, the intelligence. We were fighting not just pilots, but a nation that believed in the power of progress." His words captured the heart of what so many Luftwaffe veterans came to accept, that their defeat had been part of a larger transformation, one that went beyond tactics or technology. To the Americans, the Mustang represented that same transformation. It was proof that innovation, when combined with courage, could reshape the world. Every time it took off, it carried not only its pilots, but the hopes of an entire generation that believed the war could be won through sheer determination and ingenuity. Even decades later, the men who had flown it could recall the exact feel of the stick, the way the aircraft responded like a living thing. "It felt like it wanted to win," said Bud Anderson. "You could almost sense it." And yet, the Mustang's greatest power wasn't its speed or firepower. It was its endurance. It could stay aloft for hours, escorting bombers deep into enemy territory, something no other fighter could do at the time. That endurance was what broke the Luftwaffe, and it became a metaphor for the endurance of the men who flew it, on both sides. They had endured the cold, the fear, the loss, and somehow found meaning in it. In post-war Germany, the Mustang came to symbolize not humiliation, but excellence. It was studied in engineering schools, admired for its design, and even displayed in museums beside German aircraft as an equal. The message was clear. Progress respected no borders. What had once been an enemy machine had become a shared legacy of human achievement. Walter Schuck, who had flown hundreds of missions for the Luftwaffe, summed up that feeling late in life. "The Mustang ended our world," he said, "but it also reminded us why we loved it. To fly, to really fly, that was all any of us ever wanted. The Mustang was the last machine that made you feel that." In that sentiment lay a profound truth. The Mustang had not just ended the Luftwaffe's dominance, it had closed the chapter on an entire philosophy of flight. The lone aces, the personal duels, the myth of invincible skill, all of it gave way to the era of collective precision and technological superiority. The sky was no longer a place for lone heroes. It had become a theater of systems, strategies, and machinery. The Luftwaffe's aces had been the last of the knights, and the Mustang had been the dawn that ended their age. Even in the United States, where the P-51 was celebrated as a national triumph, there was an awareness of that bittersweet truth. Pilots spoke of the Mustang not as a weapon of victory, but as a friend who had carried them safely through hell. When they heard its engine at reunions, they didn't cheer. They nodded, smiled faintly, and remembered. "That sound," said Chuck Yeager, "is the sound of every friend I lost and every flight I survived." As time thinned their ranks, the men who had once filled the skies above Europe began to fade into history. Their stories, however, remained vibrant, a chorus of voices recalling the same unforgettable image. The moment when the silver-winged Mustangs first appeared above Germany, sunlight glinting off their fuselages, engines roaring like distant thunder. For the Luftwaffe pilots below, it was the sound of inevitability. For the Americans above, it was the sound of triumph. For all of them, it was the sound of change. At one commemorative event in the late 1990s, an aged German pilot and an American veteran stood together beside a restored P-51. The American, leaning on his cane, smiled and said, "You used to try to kill me." The German laughed softly. "Yes," he replied, "but you were hard to find. You were always above me." They both laughed then, not at the memory of war, but at the absurdity of survival, the randomness of who lived to tell the story. That perhaps is the greatest legacy of the Mustang. It turned enemies into witnesses of the same truth, that courage and respect outlive conflict. The Luftwaffe aces may have lost the war, but they gained something more enduring, a shared admiration for the machine that ended their reign and defined their generation. In the end, when the history of that war is told, the P-51 Mustang stands not only as the weapon that broke the Luftwaffe, but as the symbol of the moment when humanity reached its pinnacle of flight before stepping into a new, colder era. It was, as Galland once said, the last bird of paradise before the storm. And when one of those Mustangs takes off today, the old pilots, wherever they rest, would surely hear the echo of that sound and look up just for a moment into the endless blue. The story of when Luftwaffe aces first faced the P-51 Mustang is, in many ways, the story of the sky itself, changing hands. It is not just about aircraft, tactics, or technology. It is about human beings standing at the edge of history, watching the world they knew vanish into the clouds. The Mustang didn't just defeat the Luftwaffe. It rewrote the laws of air warfare, marking the point where the dreamers of flight became the engineers of victory. In 1943, when the first P-51Bs arrived over Europe, few could have imagined how quickly they would alter the balance. For months, German radar operators reported sightings of strange, fast aircraft escorting bomber streams farther than any fighter had before. At first, the Luftwaffe command dismissed the reports as exaggerations or misidentifications, but soon, the wrecks began to appear. German fighters brought down by an enemy they couldn't outclimb, couldn't outrun, and couldn't exhaust. They followed us home. one pilot recalled bitterly. They never turned back. That was the turning point. For years, the Luftwaffe had fought with the confidence of the hunter, always knowing that their bases were close, that fuel and reinforcements were near, and that no Allied fighter could stay over German soil for long. The Mustang shattered that illusion. With its long range, it erased the borders of safety. Suddenly, the hunters became the hunted, and yet, even in the face of defeat, there was admiration. When Luftwaffe pilots spoke later of their first encounters, they remembered not the fear, but the disbelief, the sheer wonder at the machine's capability. One veteran described watching a Mustang climb effortlessly into the thin air above 30,000 feet, its Merlin engine roaring smooth and steady. It looked unreal, he said, like something from another century. We were still flying warplanes. They were flying the future. That sense of awe echoed through every memoir, every recollection. The Mustang had become, to its opponents, something more than a machine. It was a messenger, a harbinger of the end of an era. It carried with it the message that industrial power and engineering precision could achieve what once only courage and instinct could. It was the embodiment of inevitability, of progress made unstoppable. Still, the human stories remained. There were dogfights that became legends, duels where skill and desperation collided in seconds of brilliance and tragedy. One Mustang pilot recalled chasing a Focke-Wulf 1-90 through a valley, both aircraft twisting and diving so low their propellers nearly touched the treetops. When he finally scored a hit, the German's plane erupted in flame, and he saw the pilot bail out. The Mustang circled as the parachute opened, drifting gently toward the fields below. "He waved to me," the American said softly. "I don't know why. Maybe to say goodbye. Maybe to say, 'You did well.'" That fleeting gesture, half salute, half surrender, captured what so many who fought in the air came to feel. There was no hatred up there, only a shared respect for the men who risked everything in the same fragile machines. The Luftwaffe aces, even in defeat, understood that bond. "We did not fight men," said Steinhoff. "We fought wings and courage. The color of the markings did not matter." When peace finally came and the wreckage of war littered Europe, those memories survived where the machines did not. The surviving Mustangs, once weapons of war, were sold off for scrap or civilian use, but a few were kept flying, and as they roared once again into blue skies in the years after, their sound carried more than nostalgia. It carried reverence. The Luftwaffe veterans who heard that sound felt no bitterness. Many attended air shows and reunions where Mustangs flew once more, not as enemies, but as symbols of endurance. For them, seeing a Mustang take off was like seeing time itself turn back. They could feel the adrenaline again, the quickening pulse, the rush of fear and exhilaration that only those who had lived it could truly know. And yet, standing safely on the ground, they also understood something they hadn't during the war, that the beauty of flight, even in battle, had always been greater than the destruction it brought. "We did not know it then," Galland said late in life, "but we were part of something that would never happen again. The last duel of men with wings." As the years passed and the veterans grew older, their recollections became gentler, more philosophical. They spoke less of victories and losses, and more of what it meant to live through that moment in history. "The first time I saw a Mustang," said one former German pilot, "I thought, this is the end. But when I see one now, I think, this is what the end looked like." And it was beautiful. The Mustang, more than any other aircraft of the Second World War, became a bridge across time and nationality. It was loved by its pilots, respected by its enemies, and admired by generations who came after. It was the airplane that ended one age and inspired another. In every gleaming restoration, in every rumbling flyover, its legacy continues, not as a weapon, but as a reminder of what humanity can build when courage and creativity meet. For the Luftwaffe aces, that legacy was deeply personal. Many of them lived long enough to see the world they once defended reborn in peace. They became teachers, engineers, authors, and mentors to the next generation of pilots. And always, when they spoke of their youth, the P-51 returned to the conversation. It was the ghost they could never quite escape, the adversary that had taught them humility, admiration, and acceptance. In their twilight years, men like Galland, Rahl, and Steinhoff were often asked whether they ever wished things had gone differently, whether they regretted that the Mustang had come. Their answers were strikingly similar. "No," said Steinhoff. "It had to come. History always moves forward. The sky does not belong to one flag forever." That, perhaps, is the greatest truth to emerge from their stories, that progress cannot be stopped, and that even in defeat, one can find grace. The Mustang was not just the instrument of the Luftwaffe's downfall, it was the shape of the future, the proof that human brilliance could transcend even the darkest circumstances. And so, when we look back on that moment, when Luftwaffe aces first faced the P-51 Mustang, we are not just remembering a battle, we are remembering the end of an age and the beginning of another. The last echoes of propeller thunder fading into the silence of jet-age dawn. In that moment, above the clouds of a world at war, men looked at one another through the glass of their canopies and saw something eternal. The reflection of courage, the fleeting beauty of mastery, the shared wonder of flight. And somewhere among those swirling contrails, cutting through smoke and sunlight, the Mustang flew, the silver messenger of change, the final victor of the old sky. For those who survived to tell the tale, its image never left them. The sound of its engine became the sound of memory itself, distant, powerful, impossible to forget. And as the last of those pilots left the world behind, the legend of their encounters lived on, not as stories of conquest, but as lessons in admiration, respect, and the unstoppable march of progress. The Luftwaffe aces had once ruled the air with confidence and pride, but when they first faced the P-51 Mustang, they faced something greater than an enemy. They faced the future, and though it defeated them, it also immortalized them, forever binding their names to the dawn of modern flight. They lost the war. But together with the Mustang, they wrote the final, magnificent chapter of the age of heroes in the sky.